آزادی بیان
言论自由
free speech.
OUP is the oldest and arguably most prestigious publisher in the world. And next year it will mark the centenary of its operations in India. And I stand here as an OUP author. More than half a dozen books of mine have been published by the OUP. But more than as an OUP author, as someone who has been made by the OUP. I was not a student of the University of Oxford. I was not even a doctoral student of a prestigious Indian university like Delhi or the JNU. I did my PhD in a very obscure department. In fact, I was the first doctorate in sociology from that department. And had it not been for a brilliant young editor in the OUP, I would not be standing here before you today. And the OUP in India had an extraordinary capacity of spotting, encouraging, nurturing, publishing young writers and scholars. It didn't always have that. When it started in 1912, it was essentially a place for distributing English language textbooks. There's a very fine book written, I believe, as an Oxford DPhil, called Empires of the Mind, which is about the early years of the OUP. But the OUP was transformed in the 1960s under the leadership of a visionary publisher called Ravi Dayal, who took it out of sort of a narrow emphasis on textbooks and dictionaries and reference works into social science scholarship. Because Ravi Dayal recognized that in independent India, in the 60s and 70s, the universities were producing high quality research, and that research didn't have a proper outlet, and the OUP, given its global traditions of publishing work in social sciences and history, could take advantage of that. So Ravi Dayal, for example, nurtured subaltern studies, which is not just the most influential movement in history to come out of South Asia, but the most influential movements worldwide in social sciences and the humanities. And had it not been for Ravi Dayal, subaltern studies would never have been published. Had it not been for Ravi Dayal, the works of the great subalternists, Nandini Gooptu, Gyan Pandey, Dipesh Chakravarti, Tanika Sarkar, and so on, would not have been part of the wider conversation on the modern world. And move out of history, you think of such brilliant original Indian minds such as Ashish Nandi, Sudhir Karkar, Andre Bete, M.N. Srinivas, Veena Das. These are all people who were nurtured by the OUP under the stewardship of Ravi Dayal and his extraordinary team of editors through the 70s and the 80s. I'm sure there's some literature students here. OUP also pioneered translations from Indian languages. The great modern Indian playwrights were published in English translation by the OUP. Vijay Tendulkar, Badal Sarkar, Mahesh Eklunchkar, and especially Girish Karnad. A K Ramanujan, who's here, who's at the center of the controversy today, his translation of U.R. Anantamurthy Samskara, which I think is the one standout translation of any Indian work, was published by the OUP, commissioned and published by the OUP. Ramanujan's poetry was published by OUP Oxford. Ramanujan, incidentally, remains the only Indian poet ever published in the Oxford Poetry Series. So that's the tradition of OUP India, nurtured by people like Ravi Dayal and many others. A series of general managers who followed Ravi Dayal, including Neil O'Brien, Santosh Mukherjee. Now, these were all publishers who read books and understood the importance of books. About 15 years ago, things began to change in the OUP. There were some larger structural factors. There was a worldwide trend in publishing towards a more commercial orientation, what we may crudely call, if I'm allowed to use or misuse the name of a former graduate of this university, a Thatcherization of the publishing process affected the OUP here and certainly OUP India. So the bottom line, profit became paramount, even though technically the OUP is an arm of the university which is in theory committed to promoting high quality scholarship. It made decent returns always, but making profits became the overriding objective. And the editing standards precipitously declined. I'll give you a few quick illustrations. One, from my personal experience. I wrote a book published by the OUP. It went into paperback. When the advance copy of the paperback came to me, the book had the prelim pages, the half title page, the title page, followed by the dedication page, the epigraph, the preface, and after the preface, excerpts from reviews. Now, I wonder if any of you have seen this. And no one in the OUP had checked this. And when I pointed this out to the new head of editing, that person did not know that this was not the done thing. The excerpts from reviews come right in the beginning. I'll give you another example. The OUP, because of its reputation, still attracts first-rate works by scholars because who want the imprint of the OUP. A Bangladeshi historian published a biography of Nazrul Islam. It's the first scholarly biography of the greatest poet of a large and very large and great country, Bangladesh. This biography has no index. Now, these examples are legion. Essentially, what I'm trying to tell you is this: that the OUP today is run by people who do not know about books, who have never heard of A K Ramanujan. That A K Ramanujan is arguably the most influential and most creative writer and thinker in the humanities ever produced by India. Escapes them. If the managing director, the editorial director, the literary editor had known of A K Ramanujan, we would not be meeting here today. Now, that's the larger context of why the OUP has behaved in this, shall we say, rather short-sighted way. This morning I met the CEO of the OUP and the person in charge of international rights director, and they have since issued a press release which you've seen, and essentially they are resorting to legal equivocation. They're saying, we didn't really apologize. We said if we have inadvertently, to those of you, before I go on, to those of you who don't know the facts, the controversy arose because several years ago, in 2008, in a lower court in Punjab, a right-wing lunatic filed an injunction against A K Ramanujan's essay 300 Ramayanas. Now the OUP could easily have fought that case. When it comes to their tax matters, they have recruited India's most expensive lawyer, Fali Lariman, to fight it. But when it came to a case in a lower court in Punjab, in the town called Dera Bassi, filed by this actually a quite crazy guy. If you go to sulekha.com, you'll see his rantings and ratings. And some of you would have done it. The OUP wrote saying, we are terribly sorry if we've offended anyone, and the essay is, we don't want to offend anyone inadvertently or advertently, so we are not going to publish that essay. Now the OUP's press release today says that, no, we haven't really apologized, and we've said we don't want to offend anyone and so on. Now there are legal scholars in this room, and I suppose they can, say a little more about this kind of legal equivocation. That withdrawal of the essay by the OUP allowed the University of Delhi to withdraw Ramanujan's essay, gave them an excuse to withdraw that essay from the curriculum, of the BA curriculum of the university. So the question now is, what is the way forward? I met the CEO this morning, and essentially we disagreed on the interpretation of that apology. We also disagreed on whether the book has been withdrawn. The CEO said, this is not really an apology, and I've already gone through that. Then he said, well, Ramanujan's collected essays, which contains the essay which we're talking about, 300 Ramayanas, is not out of print. It's print on demand. We are collecting orders. Actually, if you go to any bookshop, it's not available. I think Anup has checked with stockists and you can't get it. But the CEO says we are collecting orders. We've got 50 orders. Once we get 100, we may print it. So it's technically not been withdrawn. The fact is, it is not available anywhere. But then he said, I agree with you that we have a problem of perception. That there's been a worldwide outrage. A signature campaign was signed, I believe, by 453 leading intellectuals. And as I reminded Mr. Portwood, this was done in a matter of 24 hours. Normally, if you start a signature campaign, the kinds of people whom academics are, I mean, both middle-aged academics like me and PhD students like and MA students like you, we are intensely disputatious. So if a draft comes, we will scrutinize every line. Here, hatao, wo hatao, change this word, add this, not that. And normally it takes at least a week to get consensus on any letter to be collectively signed. But here, because of the extraordinary stature of Ramanujan and the gratuitous insult to his memory, within 24 hours, you had 453 signatures. So Mr. Potwood said, I agree that there is a perception problem. Many of the best writers, some of the people I mentioned, Partho Chatterjee, Romila Thapar, etc., have already left the OUP to other presses because of the decline in production editing standards. Clearly the decline will continue, so we agreed that there's a perception problem. And how do you restore it? And I said the way to restore it, since next year is your centenary year, is to immediately bring the collected essays back into print, and that would be a vindication of your respect for Ramanujan, it would be a vindication of the principle of free speech, and given the massive controversy, of course, it would be a vindication of your bottom line too, because you probably sell several thousand copies. Well, he hasn't. Well, I don't know how seriously he took my suggestion, but I would urge you to focus on that. That a successful resolution of this controversy, which is a face saver for the OUP, which does due respect to the memory of the great A K Ramanujan, which is consonance with the principles of free speech that Anup mentioned, is to, and would be, which would be an emphatic affirmation of the value of scholarship over and its and against the bigotry of fanatics, would be to have the collected essays back in print. I just end with one last word, a larger reflection. I've been thinking about in these last few days about this controversy and the way the OUP is reacting. And it struck me that this is the way in which great historic institutions react. They are supposed to be infallible. They don't admit to mistakes. The Catholic Church took years and years to admit to a problem with priests abusing young children. The United States government, also an ancient, venerable, powerful and rich institution like the Catholic Church and the Oxford University Press, took months and months to admit that there was torture going on in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay. The Congress Party, which is India's oldest party, far older than the Labour Party, for a long time stonewalled on the question of corruption. So the pressure must be put on. The first instinct of a powerful man or a powerful institution, the more powerful, the more venerable, the more ancient, the first instinct, the second instinct, the third instinct is to say nothing is wrong, we are infallible, these are misguided critics, they are malicious, they are malafide and so on. But if you press on and on and on, just as the Catholic Church finally had to admit to the transgressions by its priests, the United States government had to finally admit to the violations of the rights of detainees, just as the Congress Party had to shamefacedly admit to the widespread corruption by its governments. The OUP will have to restore, if the pressure is kept on, will have to restore the specifically, one specific suggestion, I'll end there, that we have to keep up the pressure so that the collected essays of Ramanujan are back, because that would be what we owe the scholar, what we owe the academic community, and what we owe Indian democracy. Thank you.
Sorry, I arrived late, so I hadn't been told about the order. Right. I think I might just pick up where Ram left off, which is the question of mounting pressure. But I'm not an OUP author. I'm just about to submit a manuscript to OUP Clarendon, an edited volume, but I'm not an OUP author, and therefore I do not actually have experience of OUP, so cannot speak with the same knowledge or authority with which he has done. But rather there are certain things about this that I found extremely puzzling. The first of which is, why is OUP India so afraid? What is it afraid of? This is not the first time that OUP India has shown its fear of fundamentalist forces. We've seen it in the case of James Laing's book on Shivaji, which before it was banned was in fact withdrawn by OUP. Elsewhere, not fundamentalists, but the Calcutta High Court, when it expressed its disapproval of a book by Dembowski on urban governance, OUP withdrew the book. Subsequently, of course, it's now sub judice, and we haven't had a resolution. So this is not the first time. This made me wonder that we need an answer to the question of why is OUP so afraid, and a broader question about the issue of non-state censorship, as Anup has put up there, in India. I mean, why do we have these forms of non-state censorship? Ram has talked about the profit motive, but I don't believe that's the only reason. I think we need to look for reasons why presses so easily yield to illiberal forces, and the kind of liberal pressures that this room represents does not really have much of an impact. And this is where I agree with Ram, that we need to mount that pressure. But before we get there, I think the answer to this conundrum lies in some peculiarities of liberalism in Indian political culture. And that's where I want to go eventually. But before doing that, I want to raise some general issues about forms of non-state censorship that are particularly relevant to India today. And second, I want to discuss elements of India's political culture, or rather liberalism in India's political culture, and finally suggest some ways forward. So to start with non-state censorship first, I would like to touch upon two forms in particular. One is public censorship, as mentioned by Anup already, and market censorship, which is the profit motive or Thatcherization that Ram mentioned. Now, the concept of free press or press freedom is, of course, in fact, a myth, even in societies and states where governments do not directly or overtly muzzle the press and other media. Various forms of public censorship inevitably curtail the freedom of the press in the sense of what the media feel they can or cannot publish or broadcast without courting the opprobrium or hostility of one or another section of the public. Examples of such public censorship include A, parental lobbies in the US campaigning to ban books from libraries as unfit for their children's consumption. B, self-appointed guardians attacking cultural productions on grounds of violation of sexual morality or aesthetic sensibility. C, and that is relevant here, religious or ethnic groups seeking the public exclusion of media outputs that are in conflict with their value systems. D, restraint often exercised by journalists and the media in their reliance on or mutually dependent relationship with the world of politics and private corporate business. We saw earlier controversies in India about that. And finally, auto-censorship of the mainstream media during war, crises, or conflict, in line with national policy and policy imperatives. The free press, then, is not an absolute normative liberal ideal or liberal value, but is seen as a contingent one, subject to qualifications. It is thus open to regulation through a legal framework that purports to guarantee the public interest, notably through laws of libel, slander, and privacy, that affect not the state, but private individuals as well as communities. In recent years, the use of injunctions against the press has, of course, become rampant and controversial. We have seen super injunctions in this country, but in India too, another obscure court in Assam led to the banning or excision of a chapter of Siddhartha Dev's book, The Beautiful and the Damned. And of course, public interest litigation leaves the press open to legal challenges of all kinds. This is not to condone or justify press timidity in the face of public censorship and a particularly activist judiciary in India. Rather, the aim is to draw attention to the reality of political culture and practice that the press inhabits and is a part of. It should be borne in mind here that even in the days of classical liberalism in 18th century France, as Danton and Chartier have shown, for example, the legal enshrinement of press freedom was not a straightforward outcome of the pursuit of exalted and abstract ideas of liberty and freedom, but the product of fiercely fought power struggles and a conflict over vested interests. The importance of freedom of expression did not here relate simply to an ensemble of Enlightenment ideas, but also to a set of cultural practices and notions of sociability in the public arena. The point I'm making is that, that political culture matters in how the press behaves. Press freedom can only flourish in a political culture that accords it high priority, and I will return to this later. Now on to market censorship or commercial screening. This refers to a process of intellectual filtering and restriction on the production and distribution of media outputs in conformity with profit calculations and private corporate priorities. Authors are, of course, routinely asked to provide information about the likely market niche of their books and about potential competitors, we all do this, and to present a business justification as much as an intellectual or creative case for their books. Publishers increasingly rely on point-of-sale data, such as the Nielsen book scan, that generates worldwide retail figures based on book titles and keywords. Such data determine publications' decisions rather more than the quality or content of a book in many cases. These practices have become highly prevalent in the present era of unprecedented threat to the to the printed word from the electronic media and modes of cyber communication. However, these commercial considerations are presented as neutral, rational, and unavoidable production and distribution decisions governed by market demands and consumer choice. It is not acknowledged that these are deliberate managerial responses to profit imperatives and market-based calculations without regard to the value or relevance of the content of publications. And of course, OUP have used precisely this commercial argument. These practices are normalized and considered acceptable, particularly in line with the supremacy of the notion of consumer sovereignty. Moreover, a market metaphor to justify publications' decisions is at play here. This may seem particularly compelling in contexts such as India, characterized by a new romance with the market, liberated from its status distortions of previous era. In other words, publishing decisions acquire a considerable degree of legitimacy by invoking the market logic and denying the importance of other considerations of academic or creative merit. It is moot to note here, of course, that OUP has been using precisely the argument of commercial non-viability of Paula Richmond's edited volume, Many Ramayanas. Now I move on to the question of political culture and the peculiarities of liberalism and the question of press freedom and autonomy in India. In late 20th century and 21st century world, or if you will, the postmodern world, the problem of cultural pluralism has assumed primary salience. Indeed, the liberal project, as John Gray has argued, has been restated by many recent political philosophers precisely as the problem of pluralism. This sits uneasily with, or can even be irreconcilable with, the classical liberal notion of liberty and freedom of expression for all as universal values, when viewed from the perspective of adversarial or incompatible cultural positions. Instead, the emphasis has been on accommodation of pluralism through institutional arrangements or contractual consensus. At the same time, liberalism and the idea of freedom have often come to be understood not normatively, but in pragmatic terms, as for example done by Richard Rorty, designating liberalism as a certain practice and a certain lifestyle. And as one commentator puts it, people like living in a liberal system not because it exemplifies the best true values, but because they enjoy living in such a system. It is my contention that in Indian political culture, liberalism as practice and lifestyle and its associated freedoms are valued as something that gives people the conditions for fulfilling their personal projects and to achieve personal well-being, private well-being. This is where freedom is valued, not elsewhere. Beyond that, the idea of liberal freedoms has no intrinsic or normative power. In such a milieu of lifestyle liberalism and the compulsions of pluralist accommodation, outside of an academic and intellectual circle like this, there is little or no public interest in the problem of conservative attacks on freedom of expression or on the press. And this may well explain OUP's passive stance in the Ramanujan controversy. Two further elements are important in our discussion of political culture, I think. The first is a faith in the market instead of in politics as the best allocator and the instrument of mobility and self-realization. For the moment, at least in India, the market seems to have captured public imagination as the source of progress and freedom. The second element is what might be called a culture of radical unpolitics, borrowing a term from Ulrich Beck, albeit with a somewhat modified conception here. Radical unpolitics in the Indian case could be negatively defined as elite revolt, an abdication of the upper and middle classes from electoral democratic politics, and the denial of institutional party politics as corrupt, as it has been noted by several scholars of Indian politics. Or it could be positively restated as an espousal of an alternative mode of political practice based on a notion of personal self-actualization and individual agency, usually in the form of acts of social service or NGO work, or public activism in an advocacy mode, or appealing to the courts in public interest. Radical unpolitics of this kind and its person-centric orientation discourage public and collective political engagement. This makes for a political quiet life, if you like, and laissez-faire in matters of public political contention. So the three elements of liberalism as lifestyle and pluralism, faith in the market as freedom, and radical unpolitics have tended to mutually reinforce each other and have together muted or even prevented collective mobilization and public debates on questions of freedom of expression and public or market censorship. This kind of political culture has also allowed space for the expression of illiberal, conservative or right-wing tendencies and given them a disproportionate power of intimidation in the public arena, often by further threatening recourse to the courts. This is not to say that Indian political culture is devoid of public debates or contentious politics. Indeed, people in this room disprove that very idea. However, a market-based unpolitical liberalism is arguably the dominant trend among much of the upper and middle class literate circles. Here the issues of freedom of expression and auto-censorship by the press and publishing houses are not significant preoccupations. So the way forward, I would submit, again in line with what Ram was saying, is to politically animate and ignite precisely this debate about public censorship. This may then force publishing houses to stick their necks out by giving them the confidence of public support and persuade them to exercise their autonomy, abjure commercial considerations, surmount the fear of political and legal reprisals, and act as the disseminators of scholarly and artistic excellence. Otherwise, it will always be possible for them to hide behind the argument of commercial non-viability or the principle of pluralism. OUP, of course, tendered its apology on grounds of pluralism, and still hope to enjoy a degree of public legitimacy, as OUP seems to be doing in India at the moment. It is for us then to rally behind OUP, in a sense, with the hope that the press will rise to the challenge, abandon its caution, and surmount the constraints of India's political culture. And if OUP India could then be persuaded to eschew its current timidity, it should also be possible for it to draw upon OUP Clarendon Press's international academic reputation as well as its wealth and muscle. This is, after all, the largest academic press in India, and it has in the world, and it has a lot of money. And profit motive is not always privileged. For instance, the academic division of OUP Clarendon is not its profit-making, is not known for its commercial success as compared to, say, the dictionary or the English language divisions. OUP Clarendon Press has also provided very substantial funds for a large number of student scholarships at Oxford, the Clarendon studentships, and I'm sure there are Clarendon scholars sitting here. And through its John Fell Fund, OUP has been instrumental in promoting both Blue Skies research and early career researchers in this university. What we can, however, do is take this on board and redeploy this to fit the commercial logic that OUP has used. In other words, to redefine corporate social responsibility in this context at the promotion of academic excellence, and to defy or deny public censorship of the kind that we see in the Ramanujan case. So this would, I think, allow us to do two things. On the one hand, build public pressure and engage with the peculiarities of liberalism in India's political culture. And on the other hand, deploy the notion of corporate social responsibility and engage OUP to promote academic excellence within the framework of its commercial logic.
though he was not my teacher, I knew A K Ramanujan, or Raman as he was known, when I was a student at the University of Chicago. And I can say how horrified he would have been at this untoward turn that is his essay, which has been well respected for many years now, and well circulated for as many years has taken. Ramanujan was a character who not only was cultivated, refined, interested in intellectual matters above all else, but exceptional also in the fact that in a university situation like that which prevails in the United States, which is so highly politicized and factionalized, managed to stay clear of all conflict. You know how things are, how conflict appears in universities, right? Where the smaller the monetary or institutional gain, the more bitter the rivalry. Raman understandably neglected this kind of politics because what he wanted to do most of all, and he said this repeatedly, was to devote himself to the text that he was interested in. And I think it really is a betrayal to his memory that this particular essay, but by extension his work in general, has become controversial in the manner that it has. So what I'd like to do today then is to actually, in my own imperfect way, follow up on the kind of attitude that Raman himself took and devote my talk to an analysis of the text, not his text in this case, but the text of those who oppose him, right? The rhetoric of opposition. Because what strikes me as being interesting about it is its use of the language of hurt, intimacy, hurt, and betrayal. And this, of course, is familiar in all the cases that Nandini has just mentioned, for instance. This is the language of opposition, right? That is to say, our sentiments are hurt, our feelings are hurt. India is a pluralistic society, we must respect the hurt of different groups that compose it. And of course, on the one hand, there's this sort of sentiment is entirely respectable. What's interesting about it is that this delicate moral language is so often, if not invariably, accompanied by brute physical violence. At Delhi University and at many other places when we are looking at other kinds of controversial issues. What on earth is going on here? First, of course, we should note the difference between this language of sentimentality, of hurt, and the language of non-state censorship in places like Europe, which very often bases itself on rights. Right? This language is not necessarily based on rights, though it might be. The language of opposition based on rights is one of, I have my interest, you have yours, we are opposed, my interest should be predominant because of X, Y, and Z factor, I am the majority, I am such, right? The law upholds me. Whereas in India, where a lot of this controversy seems to be going in another direction altogether, it's almost wheedling, isn't it, this language of, you must understand how vulnerable and hurt I am, even though I might have power on my side. Why can you not accept my hurt? Why can you not recognize it? It's a fundamentally different language. I think it seems to skirt around the legalistic language of rights. And that I find quite interesting. One of the reasons why I think it's interesting is precisely because, after all, it's only the sense of intimacy that is presumed by this language of hurt, sentiment, etc., that in a way makes possible the violence that comes so often with it, right? That it's only, as it were, if you rhetorically set yourself up to feel betrayed by the other, that you feel entirely justified in exercising or wreaking violence against that person or that institution or that group. So it is, you have betrayed my trust in you, you have betrayed my relationship to you, you have not acknowledged my hurt. All I have asked you to do is to recognize it and to be therefore respectful of my opinions. And all this, as I said very often, without even invoking the language of rights. Of course, there is a limit to this kind of sentimental language. And that limit is approached when such people then go to court, where the language of rights does come in, after all. And how those two languages come together strikes me as being very important and very interesting. But I would like to ask if this presumed intimacy, that the vulnerability, that this notion of I am vulnerable, my feelings are hurt, this intimacy need only lead to violence, or can it lead to something else as well? Can it actually lead to, if you will, a more harmonious coexistence? I don't know. I would just like to point out that the language of rights too has at least two aspects, right? And I think Nandini's talk also mentioned this, that you can have a language of rights deployed to protect those who are weak and vulnerable, and you can have it deployed by those who are strong against those who actually are weak and vulnerable. And we see in this country and elsewhere in Europe a situation sometimes where it is people who are in fact vulnerable and in a minority who are asked to, as it were, tolerate the majority. Right? That, you might argue, is an inappropriate use of the language of rights. And it's certainly inappropriate when you think about the fact that those who then champion the rights of toleration point to figures like Voltaire. Voltaire, after all, who in his famous defense of Protestants in France, for instance, would defend the rights of those who were weak or vulnerable, not the rights of those who were strong and powerful. So I think it might actually help us to reflect upon where this language of intimacy, betrayal, hurt might lead to. It can lead to violence, indeed to excess violence, but might it also lead somewhere else? And the reason I ask this question is because I suspect that one of the things that's going on here is that the language of hurt, sentiment, vulnerability, offense occupies to some degree a kind of non-legal space, right? It seems to want to occupy a social space that is not to do with rights, etc., etc. And after all, the language of law is applicable only in certain instances. That is to say, it cannot inform our existential sense of who we are all the time. How is it possible to actually address this? How is it possible for us to think about what a non-legal space of violence and hurt might be, and how we might intervene? Because I think that we're often, quite rightly, but also by default, forced into the position of defending the law, freedom of expression, against censorship, all of these things which are only right and proper to do, and which is what we are here to do, in essence. But in doing so, we sometimes neglect the fact that the language that is taking offense is operating in another field altogether, that it accidentally might come into contact with the language of rights and the law, but it doesn't necessarily have to do so. So the question remains open. When this happens, is it the language of law and right that is winning out, or is it its opposite that is winning out? When someone like this goes to court and gets OUP to back down and say, we acknowledge the plurality of India, is it that this non-legalistic language is assuming the rhetoric of rights, or is the language of rights being, as it were, infiltrated and limited by this other way of thinking? I think that's also a genuine question, though it might be a bit arcane in this context to ask. I think one of the consequences of this problem has been that those who are on the defensive, those who are not wreaking violence, those who have to actually protect freedom of expression and such, are, and this might sound like a counterintuitive thing to say, are forced into the position of, they are put in the straitjacket of the law. In other words, they have no other position to occupy but that of defending the law. Whereas those who are against them seem to be free to range everywhere else, right? They can actually take their debate outside, extra legal reasons can be given that can invoke social sort of pressures, that can invoke all kinds of things. And I say that this is counterintuitive because, of course, it's common, at least among historians, to think that the law, the language of the law, is at the end of the day there to represent established power. Not only that, but that it primarily represents that. Here you see something apparently quite different happening. That it's those who actually, whether they are writers or painters or filmmakers, must perch upon the language of the law and defend it and have no other existential sense of self but it. It's curious, isn't it? Because you would think that it's the law that's a dominating factor here. But in these controversies, it appears to be as vulnerable as anything else. And how one deals with that, I suspect, is a long-term important task for all of us to think about. So I'd like to conclude by saying that, to reinforce what Ram said earlier, this issue and what Nandini said, OUP has done this before, has been involved in such controversies before. To my knowledge, it has never made any strong statement about them. This is crucial, especially today, when India is an increasing market to go back to that particular logic of published material. We know, for instance, that whereas elsewhere in the world, newspaper runs are being restricted, in India they're increasing. Right? So the printed word is actually a kind of, it has a different kind of status in India than it has elsewhere. It's apparently not being cut back by electronic publications and all the rest. This is a growing market. It's an important one because of that. It's an important academic market, no less. The precedent set by this is not simply about one essay or two essays by A K Ramanujan. This is about publishing in India, the freedom of thought and expression in India, which is at the same time a matter of extra-Indian interest also, partly for market reasons, but for purely intellectual reasons as well, as Ram was saying. What gets produced in India, not least by a publisher like OUP, is new thought that has world historical importance. I don't want to sound too triumphalist about it, but I think it is indeed true, and that this can only increase, this can only continue. So to tolerate this sort of thing is actually to put a spanner in the works in a very serious way. It's a form of compromising not only what has happened in India intellectually, but what continues to happen, and what all of us who are here, after all, either at the University of Oxford and other universities in this country or elsewhere, are invested in. So it is in all our individual interests to make sure that at the very least, a strong statement is made by OUP, and that the essay is reissued in some form or the other. Because this is not, even though I began with it, this is not merely about A K Ramanujan. It is about all of us. Thank you.